We're pretty flexible in this too. I know a lot of times people just do presentations and take discussions towards the end, but if people have questions, we'll try to monitor that.
Okay.
Hey, just joined. This is Addison.
Hey, Addison. Great. We'll wait a few more minutes. A couple more people joining.
Good. So you get Steve, Heath, Matt, Carol, Lindsay, and Amy.
Okay.
Franz, if it's all right with you, why don't we go ahead and get started? We might have one or two others join us.
Okay, sounds great.
All right. Did I just see someone else? So for the folks from the chamber, I wanted to take just a minute and introduce Franz and Addison, and let me just tell everybody up front. I told Franz it was okay. They're going to record this conversation, so that again, if there are other people at the chamber that want to be able to to hear the conversation, we use that. But just to give you a heads up ahead of time. And my apologies ahead of time. I'm going to have to jump off in about 20 minutes or so to jump on a call with Tom. But let me just first thank Franz and Addison for doing this briefing this morning. As I think everyone knows, we're talking about ideas that they've been working on to help restore and provide science technology support to congressional offices, committees, and others. These are my words, not theirs. This was, you think back to the days, or those of you who remember the Office of Technology Assessment in Congress. Again, my words, it was a casualty of reforms that came about in the 1995 timeframe. Somewhat understandable after 40 years of, or the first time in 40 years of a partisan change in control of the House, but nonetheless, it did leave a gap, and that's one of the things that they're addressing. But just very briefly, Franz Werkmanstobler, I worked with Franz for many years. In fact, all three offices he worked in the Senate, Senator Byrd, Senator Dorgan, and Senator Coons, I had the opportunity to work with them primarily on energy issues along the way. So and he's working with the BPC and their governance program as a senior advisor. And Addison is there as the Associate Director for Energy Innovation, and comes to BPC as an alumni of the ARPA-E program. And if you've looked at his bio at all, he managed to somehow get a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT along the way as well. So they didn't send the B team this morning to talk to us here. But with that, Franz, Addison, let me turn it over to you guys.
Well, thanks very much, Marty. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. Sorry, I'm plug in real quick. This is an opportunity we hope to have for a couple of weeks, and we're finally able to put it together. We were having this discussion when things were starting to, offices were starting to shut down, so understandably a lot of delays. My name is Franz. I've been a senior policy advisor at the BPC for just over a year now, and worked in Congress for about 20 years, energy, environment, natural resource issues. But in addition to that, was involved in a variety of things related to science technology. For those who may have remembered, there was something called the Competes Act in the mid-2000s, and other activities since that time to try to increase the importance of science and technology policy with the economy, national security, and other things. So I'll just give a quick chance for my colleague Addison to introduce himself a little bit more. And then we'd like to talk through a couple of topics, but please feel free to ask questions. We want to try to keep this as informal as possible. And I know that you could also put questions in the chat too, if you'd like to, as we go through this.
Great, thanks, Franz. And I'm Addison Stark. Thanks, Marty, for introducing me. I've been at BPC now for a year and a half, focusing primarily on energy and innovation issues. So thinking about the full innovation life cycle and how we take technologies from the lab and get them out and deploy them. And so a lot of this is really in this nexus of technology and policy, where we recognize that, there is a certain challenge in policy making around this space. And one of the things that has become very apparent to me in the lack of OTA that led to a project we started about a year ago now, looking into the history of OTA, how we can think about S&T capabilities on the Hill. And it's led to, with the timing of Franz joining BPC, he has a very strong interest in this piece as well. So we've found a way to start collaborating on thinking about this challenge. So I'll turn it back to Franz right now to kick things off. But certainly happy to chime in as we go.
Thanks a lot. So the reason we wanted to have the conversation with you all at the Chamber and others as well is that this is an introductory briefing to science and technology policy on Capitol Hill. It's not broadly about science and technology policy, but realizing that of the three branches of government, this is one of the two branches, primarily with the executive as the other, that really has lost some of its capacity over the years. And those are really challenging for a variety of reasons. Technology innovation is rapidly changing the economy. Right now, we're dealing with a public health scare, pandemic. Those types of public health issues are critical. National security is certainly very important in terms of how we are able to address importance of technology, issues with cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, and that Congress needs to be up to speed on many of these issues. They are difficult, they are challenging, they are complex. We certainly realize that, and we're not claiming to have any particular expertise in these areas, but say that there needs to be the resources available on Capitol Hill to help members of Congress, to help committees, to help staff to address that. One of the important things too, that having that type of expertise is that there's actually ways that it saves taxpayer dollars as well. Two specific examples are that the original OTA did an assessment of the Social Security Administration's computer purchases. This is back in the early 90s, and found that they could save millions of dollars for the Social Security Administration. Secondly, the Spectrum auction that many people are aware of just is available and periodically happens through the FCC. That originally started through some recommendations by an OTA report in the early 90s as well. So both in saving dollars or providing income to the federal government, those are ideas that were put forward as assessments and ideas by the original OTA. Further, just as all of us are now working on the outside of Congress, we do appreciate and understand that nonpartisan, evidence-based policy assessment is very important. And having seen that experience from the inside, being able to go informally to an appropriate nonpartisan office to ask questions is often very helpful. Lobbying is an important part and certainly an opportunity for any type of organization, but for staff and for members to be able to ask those questions without feeling like they're in a public forum is really important too. And at the end of the day, it gives members of Congress the necessary understanding so that when they're dealing with complex issues, they understand some of the background and know when or how to address that. And that's been part of the challenge. Why has this been, or what's the current working environment that we're dealing with? It's become increasingly hard. As many of you may have a sense with those shifts that have happened in Congress over, say, the last 10 to 15 years, the reservoir of expertise is certainly dropped. There's been turnover by members who have either lost or retired. In those cases, what happens oftentimes on committees, especially, is staff on those committees retire as well, or they go on to other places. The number of staff that have been in place for some of the support organizations like the Government Accountability Office, as well as the CRS, has been limited as well. There's a lack of seasoned staff, and you see this in terms of the lifespan of many congressional staffers. As a study that was recently done is 2.5 years. Certainly there are staff who stay longer than that, but it's hard to get a real sense of things if you're there for that short of time. That's just over one Congress, and we also know certainly that the low pay and the very challenging work environment adds to that. So it doesn't bode well for having a lot of that type of expertise that's more in place on the executive side. There are programs that help with that, fellowship programs. There's Sea Grant Fellows and AAAS Fellows and Brookings Legis Fellows. Those are great. It's good to have those types of organizations who can bring people up who have some sort of expertise, but that's not intended to be a replacement for having additional science and technology support staff through a GAO, potentially a modernized OTA or elsewhere, to help Congress out. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Addison to talk through a little bit about the report that we did and the types of resources that are available within Congress right now.
So, and to touch on, and actually, as I was listening to Franz there, it reminded me why we first did our report on OTA a year ago in the first place. I remember it was about 6 months into my joining BPC, and I was up on the Hill meeting with an unnamed staffer who was working on a bill on the electric grid, and we got to talking about voltage, and quickly realized, thinking about transmission versus distribution, it's at different voltages. And I quickly realized that this person that was working on this legislation didn't know what voltage was. It got to the point where I was taking my keys out, dropping them to talk about potential energy. And it was to the point where, okay, so we have a very serious lack of scientific and technical knowledge while we're simultaneously trying to legislate on a very technical issue. That's actually what led to me asking the question, having not come from a legislative background at all, why do we lack this type of technical knowledge, and why am I taking keys out and teaching high school physics in the process of advising on legislation? So we dove into the history of, OTA. I had an analyst that was with us last year dive in and ended up writing a really excellent report that we did last year on the history of OTA. And some of the great things that we learned was, it existed for 20 years. It was first appropriated in 74, and it was, the last appropriation was in 96. But during that time, had done 750 technology assessments and background papers and materials for across a range of topics, which are still relevant today. Healthcare, education, defense, energy and space, biotech and IT. During the time in the early 90s and the 80s, it was really relevant in creating a lot of the necessary information as the internet expanded and became a really large part of the economy. In 95, OTA had a $22 million budget, and it had around 200 staff, and that was the last functional year. And compared to today over at Congressional Research Service, they have 125 million, so much larger, 543 employees in 2019. And by comparison, also GAO has a $589 million budget and a much larger organization, but with a lot of other competing focus areas. And so, since OTA was defunded, Capitol Hill's science and technology requests have been mostly fulfilled by the CRS and the GAO, and also the National Academies National Research Council, but all of them are not really strategically aligned in exactly what OTA was doing previously. However, more recently, and at the beginning of 2019, GAO created their STAA team, where technology assessment and S&T evaluations were combined to try and fill this void, but it's still not entirely filled. And I know that Franz will be diving in a little bit more about what the existing gaps are as he continues. So Franz?
Thanks a lot. So I guess we just want to hit on, so from the standpoint of an organization like the Chamber, you all deal with a variety of things that impact business, the economy, and other important policy areas. We're not arguing here that science and technology resources aren't available to the Hill, but they certainly have been weakened over the years and diminished in the ability of how members of Congress and staff are being able to utilize and work in back and forth with those types of experts. The topics include, and sort of like top of high priority issues, certainly now public health, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, data privacy, gene editing are very big issues that a lot of members are asking about, in addition to a whole variety of topics that are just, from energy to health to infrastructure, just to name a few that people care about. Very recently, there was a cyberspace solarium commission, a bipartisan, bicameral commission that completed a report after more than a year of work. That was in March of this year. And among their many recommendations, which were certainly focused on cybersecurity, they also recognized that there needed to be a return of some type of an OTA, that was one of the links that Congress didn't have. Furthermore, some of you may be aware that the House, at the beginning of this last Congress, created a special committee on the modernization of the House. And they have made a number of recommendations, more than 140. Among those recommendations, they also, on a bipartisan basis, recommended that there be some sort of modernized OTA as a benefit, not just to the House, but to the Congress overall. So how does this compare? And I guess I just want to put this front and center for the moment. In terms of the overall discretionary budget, which we're not dealing with the emergency funding to the response to COVID at the moment, but it's approximately $1.3 trillion, which covers all federal agencies. That also is the three branches of government. Most people do not realize that the legislative branch and the judicial branch, which are the other two, are approximately 0.5% each of the entire discretionary budget. So that means that the legislative branch and judicial branch are 1%, and the executive branch is 99% of the discretionary budget. That's not very much. That's not grown to the same extent that the overall budget has increased over the years, and certainly there's been a lot of constraints. We believe that the Congress should have those resources. The closest equivalent to that in the executive branch might be something akin to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Was established in 1976 and is available to the president, is the coordinating body for all technical type organizations and agencies on the executive side. They do provide that type of support for the president and for all of those agencies. And that's part of the piece that is missing on the congressional side. If you think about the situation with the COVID and the current pandemic now, the CDC and the NIH certainly have their hands full in dealing with all of the challenges. They don't need to be the advisory board to Congress, but there really hasn't been that type of support that Congress has. So they end up turning to outside groups trying to get information. If there was a beefed up public health type function within either the GAO or a new OTA, that really could help address part of that. And it kind of a more obscure journal article, which I'm happy to send along and with some highlights, pointed out a lot of the areas where Congress really could have had this expertise that might have been helpful. Not saying that had stopped the pandemic situation, but in terms of a better response and the type of support that Congress could have had. So we just want to make sure that these sort of fundamental building blocks are in place as these challenges come up. When looking at this, a lot of reports besides this Cyber Solarium Commission recommendation, the biggest and the most prevalent that is related to the conversation today was commissioned actually by the Legislative Branch Appropriations Subcommittee more than a year ago. So in FY19, they called for it. And that report was completed in November 2019. The National Academy of Public Administration issued this report looking at a variety of issues on science and technology policy support on the Hill. And I think Addison can pull up the graphic, which is the one graphic that I want to show folks just to get a sense of the type of recommendation they made. Thanks a lot. This is from their executive summary and is in their full report too. The primary thing I would like to point out is if you start at the top and go to the bottom, it's essentially the types of products that the agencies could make available to members of Congress, from very quick turnaround documents to very long-term horizon scanning documents. Long-term trends in the economy and in technology are at the bottom. On the far right side column that says current providers, those are the agencies in Congress that usually have the main responsibility for that. But what the National Academy of Public Administration report pointed out is if you see that modest gap, and then at the very bottom, a gap, they pointed out that these are areas that currently either are missing some support or don't have it at all. And as a demonstration of where there needs to be some more focus within the Congress. So that was attachments that we had provided earlier. If folks are interested, we can certainly make that available now, but this is just the primary point of that gaps exist and a real challenge in trying to make that available to members. So thanks a lot, Addison. Besides the Bipartisan Policy Center, a number of organizations have been involved in this. Harvard has done some work. Organizations like the Lincoln Network and Demand Progress and the Levin Center have done work on this. There's actually a fairly large coalition of nonprofits, of academic, of think tanks who've really followed this for years. But we believe that that's one segment of support, and that this is also critical and as a building block for what industry and the private sector should care about. The big challenge here is that the legislative branch, as mentioned, is a very small part of the budget, but really has been flat funded. First and foremost, Congress looks to the best they can to make sure that members' budgets are covered. Staff salaries are certainly top of the priority list in terms of seeing if it's possible to address that. Security is a big deal, and the Capitol Police have gotten requisite increases over the years for protecting members and facilities. Major building projects have happened, the Capitol Visitor Center, the Capitol Dome, rebuilding the Cannon Building, the work on the Russell building, work on the Hart building, all of that have been a big part of where funds have gone. We just want to be, we're very realistic about this, but we'll also believe that there is a growing bipartisan interest, that this shouldn't be a partisan issue, and that there's an importance of having this available for members and staff. Certainly, if folks have any questions, we're also willing to kind of entertain those. I'm checking the chat to see if there's anything. So this is the kind of the key part of the presentation. We wanted to keep it open, but wanted to see if you all have any questions regarding some of the comments that we've made so far.
If we can't speak, that means we can't hear. So then it's not Spanish.
Hello?
No.
Uh-oh.
I just muted Dan. I don't think that was a question.
All right. Okay.
Not all.
Oh.
Hey guys, Matthew Eggers with the Chamber.
Yes, thanks.
Hey, thanks for the run through. I appreciate it. So you guys mentioned cyber. I guess it's probably worth flagging that we're very familiar with the commission and its work, and we've been hosting commissioners and so forth to talk about elements of the report. And we've actually gone through all the 75 some recommendations, including 1.2.1 on teeing up the OTA, getting its back on its feet. You know, I think at least our stakeholders are inclined to kind of look on that pretty positively. That's kind of a working thought, and I wanted to share that to the group. But anyway, we're very familiar with that commission report, and I think that's our initial take.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, that's I know the chamber had been involved in some of that. Didn't know how much you might have. I wouldn't call it probably a primary recommendation from the report, but certainly as a support recommendation from the congressional side. And that I don't know if that's your full take on it, but it seemed like a helpful element.
My last thing for me is, my impression is it wouldn't necessarily take an act of Congress to tee this thing back up. But what was your take on that? Do you need a law or anything, or how would it get reinstituted?
Great. That's a great question. Thanks. So when the OTA was defunded in 1995, the underlying statute was not taken away, just the funding, and no additional funding has been provided since then. Honestly, it could be restarted immediately just by providing new funding in an appropriations bill, and that's provided through the legislative branch, which covers the entire Congress. I would also add to that, though, that the original OTA had a structure and had some elements to it that may not make it as conducive as should be for this current moment. There is legislation that has been introduced on the Senate and the House side in support of a modernized OTA framework, basically dealing with some of the critiques and criticisms of that previous structure. The legislation was introduced by Tom Tillis and Mazie Hirono, and then on the House side by Takano from California. So that's the authorizing legislation to modernize an OTA. That could then coincide with additional appropriations that would be provided through the legislative branch. On top of that, there are some ideas out there in terms of beefing up, continuing to beef up, and sort of better structure the funding and mission that's available within the GAO. The GAO is playing a larger role, as Addison mentioned, within this office called the STAA. So those would be primarily the ways that I think you could address that. Um, I guess I'll just be honest. I don't think we want to necessarily bring back the old OTA,
Yeah.
but if we were able to update it a bit to the types of needs today, as well as this is the challenge, is to find ways to bring it back in a staged way that doesn't seem like a lot of additional bureaucracy.
Yeah. Maybe one last thought for sure is, and the only thing I could see where some members may have a problem with a new OTA, let's say, is if it gets into the business of endorsing or calling for, let's say, cyber mandates on businesses, which there are plenty of those, and I can see people getting not excited about that. But anyway, thanks for the walkthrough.
Okay, and I would say one of the challenges on the GAO side is GAO sets the gold standard in terms of accounting and accountability, but at times, as you all may know, members of Congress and staff and committees need a little bit quicker turnaround and the type of products that they often need. The rigor and the rigidity of the GAO process, which is certainly top notch and a gold standard, often lends itself to not be as responsive as it should be. And that's the type of thing that a revised or modernized OTA could handle. So this gets into some of the nitty gritty of what is next. And certainly we're very open to those types of conversations of like, what is practical, what works, what could be a bipartisan approach. We do definitely believe that GAO serves a very important role, but certainly within that STA emission, it often takes them a long time to get a product out the door, which isn't always as responsive as it could be. That doesn't mean that there still would need to be. That does mean there still needs to be work on a sort of modernized OTA role, but that's just kind of be front and center for you about the practical challenges that are there now. I would also add one thing that just kind of came to mind is this should be something that members of Congress and staff know about. One of the challenges is probably very few, I would say a small minority of members and offices even know this STA mission exists within the GAO. And how you can utilize a resource and a tool if you don't know it exists is really hard. So it's both a chicken and egg question.
Correct. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from folks? Okay.
Your exposition was flawless, Franz.
Thank you. Well, what we'd like to do, hopefully, with this is continue the conversation. If anyone is interested, we'd be happy to, introduce you to the larger group of people that are working on this issue, recognizing that this is sort of one element and a building block in the type of resources Congress needs. We're not saying that Congress doesn't need to address security and buildings and member salary and staff salaries, but as people are working on issues, as Addison mentioned, staff not having that basic background in many cases, and members who aren't aware of some of the challenges really makes it hard for Congress to address those policies in a meaningful and sort of measured way. So either it doesn't get addressed oftentimes, or it may get addressed in an extreme way, which is certainly not an ideal approach. So with that, certainly had planned for an hour. We've covered it as in a little bit of a quicker way, and we've thanks for your time. I'll give you 25 minutes back, and with your day. So we very much appreciate it, and know that we're going to be continuing to work on this.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
A lot. You're welcome.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, bye.